So, welcome everybody on this module of cost calculation, finances and contracts. My name is Endrik Limburg. I'm a project manager working in project consulting and planning at the Clinical Trial Center Cologne. And let's start with having a look into the structure of this presentation. It's going to be three parts. The first will be the cost calculation itself. The second part will be financing of clinical trials. And the third part will be the contracting in clinical trials. But let's start off with the cost calculation. What we do have is clinical trials that do have high quality and safety requirements. We do have complex organizations, we do have many partners, we do have many resources, like resources for personnel, for equipment, like the investigational medicinal product, like consumables, for suppliers, for external services, for fees. And we have to keep in mind that an underfunded clinical trial cannot be conducted with required quality. So an underfunded clinical trial is unethical. So what do the costs in a clinical trial actually depend on? Well, they depend on the regulatory classification, of course, on the number of cases in our clinical trial, on the study duration, on the clinical endpoints, the risk for the study participants, like the quality requirements that are connected to that, the complexity of the examinations of the treatments, the complexity of the study organization, and of course the development stage of the investigational medicinal product. So when we talk about costs, we need to talk about cost categories as well. And we can categorize our costs into direct personnel costs, into indirect personnel costs, into direct material resources, into indirect material resources, and into services. And on the following pages, we're going to have a little bit more detail into that. So direct personnel costs, they are operational costs, meaning everybody that is working directly in the clinical trial, like the project lead, the study lead, medical project lead, medical writing, medical monitoring, like project management, monitoring data management, like safety, like biometrics, like the costs for the clinical trial site itself, the medical members of the clinical trial team, the study nurses, the study coordinator. And in addition to that, to the direct personnel costs, there are also indirect personnel costs. They are from non-operational departments, like the quality management, the legal department, the controlling, the IT department, not involved directly in the clinical trials, but the costs are there nonetheless. So let's do the same with a look into material costs and divide them into direct and indirect material costs. For the direct material costs, it's easy. It's in any case the fees, like fees for the ethics committee, like fees for the authorities, like insurances or safety reports. There are other direct material resources as well, like the IMP, the investigational medicinal product, devices, consumables, shipping costs, printing costs, costs for travel, publication costs, data storage, archiving costs at the end of the clinical trial. In contrast to that, there again, there are the indirect material resources like the IT equipment, software licenses. If you use questionnaires in your clinical trial, maybe licenses for using these questionnaires, and of course, resources for the infrastructure you use. Then there are services, external services like a pharmacy, a laboratory, a radiology department, microbiology, reference centers, costs for a CRO or an ARO. The CRO is the clinical research organization, and in contrast to that is the ARO, an academic research organization like the Clinical Trial Center Cologne. We call ourselves an ARO, an academic research organization. So for the concept of a cost calculation, you have to ask yourself what work needs to be carried out. You determine personnel costs, you convert workloads into costs, and you need, of course, to ask what fees are incurred, what materials, equipments need to be purchased, and what other costs are involved. And so you determine the costs for that as well. Then you do a full cost calculation. Full cost calculation means you calculate the personnel costs for central tasks, including expenses of the trial management, and local tasks in the study center at the clinical trial site. These are the so-called investigator fees. We're going to come to them in a few slides. You have to add, of course, material costs and the external services, mostly from offers. And then you add the calculations and ask yourself, how much does my clinical trial cost? It is a general question, how much does a clinical trial cost? And it's a question where you can't come up with a good and easy answer. What you can do is have an idea what a clinical trial not overall costs, but what it costs per study participant. So if you keep out of this the costs for the investigational products and keep out the investigator fees, you're going to see that small clinical trials are way more expensive than large clinical trials, and the most expensive clinical trial is a clinical trial that is done first in human. So if you think about a trial in the range of 10 patients, then you're going to end up with 30,000 to 60,000 euros per study participant. If you look into small, medium and large clinical trials, you're going to see as the numbers of study participants go up, the euros per study participant come down. So a small clinical trial will be in the range of 15 to 30,000 euros, a medium clinical trial 8 to 15,000, and a large clinical trial 4 to 8,000 euros. So this is what you can just expect from a clinical trial to cost without the IMP and without the investigator fees. So let's have a look into the investigator fees. The important bit here is you need an effort-based calculation of all additional study-related costs at the clinical trial site. And if you think of study-related costs, then you think of all the costs that will come on top of the clinical routine. Means you have a clinical trial that is basically clinical routine with just a little bit add-on. So the investigator costs will be far lower than, say, for a phase 1 clinical trial where there simply is no clinical routine. So you can have a wide range of costs depending on the study design. The cost range here will be something like 1,000 to 10,000 euros. This is not uncommon, can be below and above that, of course, but this is a common range for clinical trials. And the important thing is that you need an effort base, a transparent calculation. And if you do transfer money, so this investigator fee will go, of course, to the external trial sites. So if you transfer this money, you have to think of external overheads and external VAT for these trial sites as well, and add them to your cost calculation. And important, at the University Hospital of Cologne, you're going to need a calculation tool. It is mandatory to use and it's available on the intranet, and you will receive it from the third-party funding department. Since clinical trials are important, you're going to ask yourself, of course, are there any saving opportunities? And so a big saving opportunity is quality by design. So what you do is you design a clinical trial with inbuilt quality that has a high chance of running smoothly and in the time you planned. So good planning and sufficient time for planning is important for that. Then you should limit your questions to the main questions to answer, and you would avoid additional questions that end up in your CRF, your case report form, that will just blow things up and will make the trial more complex and don't help you to answer your main questions. The involvement of fewer well-recruiting and experienced study centers or trial sites with study experience will also help to keep costs down, because working with experienced partners will help, and this is not only true for the trial sites but for all project partners in your clinical trial. There are, of course, a few aspects where you can't save any costs, like the number of cases, like the quality for the clinical trial, or the safety for the trial participants. So let's have a look into the second part of this presentation, and we're going to dive into the financing of clinical trials. The possible sources of funding are manifold, and just to name the big ones, it's the European Union, the federal government, state funding, foundations, non-profit organizations, industry partners, of course, as well. And there are quite a few good overviews of funding programs, for example, for the German Research Foundation, DFG, the DFG. You can see the link here. Then we do have a clinical trials program. These are projects in patient-oriented clinical research and can be one-stage or two-stage application procedures. The link is here provided as well. Then at the German Research Foundation, again, there is the research grant. This is for the implementation of a thematically limited research project. It's for the provision, it provides funds for personnel, scientific equipment, for consumables, travel, and publications. And it's a one-stage application procedure. The link is provided here as well. And then there are the general funding informations of the federal government. There are various topics relevant to public health, not always in connection with the clinical trial. So the link is here. You can have a look on that page as well. And there is the Ministry of Education and Research, the BMBF, and they do have current announcements of funding programs and funding guidelines. Follow the link provided. And we also do have the Innovation Committee at the Federal Joint Committee, and there are funding opportunities in the area of new forms of healthcare and health service research. And there is, of course, for you, the homepage of the Clinical Trial Center Cologne. If you're working with industry partners in your clinical trial, then you have to keep in mind you as a researcher will mean that the university of the trial is the sponsor of the clinical trial. So you, as the initiator of the clinical trial, you are responsible for the complete planning for the entire project, and the ownership of the data for inventions and publications lies with you or the university. The industry does give trial support, and this can be, for example, in the provision of investigational medicinal products or in cost coverage. And they will receive study results, for example, in form of a final report. So let's take a look into clinical trials at the University Hospital of Cologne. When you plan third-party funding for your clinical trial, the third-party funding department must be involved when you apply for the funding. The calculation of the investigator fees can only be done via the official tool of the third-party funding department, and you need an approval from the Dean's office if you apply for funding volumes larger than 500,000 euro. And for many applications, you need a legally binding signature on the application form, and that can only be provided by the financial director. That can be obtained from the third-party funding department. So let's take a look into the last of our three topics of today, and this is contracting in clinical trials. You have to conclude contracts when obligations, when responsibilities are defined, or if funds are transferred. The central components of a contract are the presentation of all services and considerations, the disclosure and approval of benefits, and the equivalence of service and compensation. You do conclude contracts with funding partners, cooperation partners, clinical trial sites, service providers like, for example, the pharmacy, central laboratories, the manufacturer, CROs, or with involved committees like the DMSC, this is the Data Monitoring and Safety Committee, or a steering committee. Regarding the contracts at the University Hospital of Cologne, it is important that you involve a third-party funding department and the legal department as early as possible. And you have to keep in mind that a contract partner is always the University of Cologne. And you have to consider internal and external overhead regulations and the VAT liability. And you have to use current templates for contracts. The third-party funding department or the legal department can provide you with the current version of these contract templates, of course. Then, the cost calculation using a suitable tool is mandatory. The definition of payment dates should be based on milestones, and milestones should be based on services. And the invoicing will be done by the university or by requesting funds for publicly funded projects. So the conclusion of that, clinical trials require sufficient funding. The precise, detailed, comprehensive financial planning is necessary before you can start a clinical trial, and there are many opportunities for raising third-party funds. The requirements of the university or the university hospital must, of course, be followed, and an early contact with the Clinical Trial Center Cologne is highly advisable. This is all for today. I thank you for joining, and if you have questions, if you have remarks, and if you need further information, contact me via email, via phone. Thank you very much.